This is a story that never made it into court ledgers or respectable newspapers. It traveled instead along back roads and riverbanks, in kitchens where the fire was kept low and voices lower still. Grandmothers passed it to granddaughters while shelling peas. Men fitted it into the cadence of work songs so that a warning could be sung in plain sight. A legend born in the dark learned to survive in the dark, stitched into quilts, hidden in Bible margins, or carried like an ember in the mouth of someone walking north. The name at its center was Melinda. The place was Richmond, Virginia. The hour was just before dawn on the 31st of December, 1859, when the old year was preparing to die and a dynasty with it. By the banks of the James River, frost had crusted the grass, and the water moved with winter's slow reluctance. The Mackenzie property sprawled along 60 acres, like a lord who had kicked his boots up on the land and dared anyone to move them. From the road, it looked ordinary enough. Cotton fields dull to winter stubble, a main house that wore imported mahogany and crystal-like armor. Outbuildings hunched under the cold. Visitors saw prosperity and believed they had seen truth. But people who lived and worked there knew the facade concealed a machine. Its gears were human, its fuel was suffering, and its overseer Anson Mackenzie kept notes with a scientist's calm that made the whole thing feel less like a plantation and more like a laboratory. Even in a slaveholding South familiar with cruelty, the Mackenzies were a rumor that made other rumors quiet down. Anson had inherited common acres and turned them into something calculated. He divided the land into sections, fields for respectability, cabins for isolation, barns converted into places where girls were pushed into motherhood the way cattle are pushed down chutes, a basement where certain doors never opened onto daylight. He wrote everything, the times, the temperatures, the tones of voice that produced obedience. He tested the mind the way others tested soil, depriving some of sleep until their grip on the world thinned, keeping others in silence so long that sound returned like pain. He called part of it correction by silence, a phrase so tidy it felt like a lie even as it worked. Above this laboratory hung all the trappings of triumph: Persian rugs to tread upon, crystal to toast with. At dinner, the Mackenzie brothers spoke about people the way planters spoke about crops, like progress and failure could be weighed on the same scale. Children were taught early to listen, to repeat, to find reward in becoming the knife that cut their own blood. The house itself had learned the work. Floorboards knew where to creak and where to keep the secret of a quiet step. Chains hung like decoration, though everyone knew better. The legend says the last dawn of 1859 came with a peculiar stillness, the kind that arrives before a storm and convinces the birds to hold their tongues. Richmond's smoke lifted sluggishly, the slave market not yet awake, the city still dreaming of profit while the year exhaled. It was a dangerous season in Virginia, dangerous for men who owned other men and women. Only weeks earlier, at Harper's Ferry, John Brown had tried to turn a small town's arsenal into a match for a nation's conscience. Planters slept more lightly after that. The patrols sharpened. The faces of the powerful took on a public calm and a private suspicion. Under such a sky, any silence could be a hiding place for a plan. The sources for what happened that night were always partial. Slaves who fled left fragments behind like breadcrumbs for anyone brave enough to follow. A younger Mackenzie brother, Isaac, away at school when the house darkened, would later assemble the pieces with a careful shame. Work songs remembered the rhythm of boots in a corridor, quilts mapped roads where a lantern would burn in a safe window. And then there was the long memory of people whom history often treats like a chorus, never the lead. They sang Melinda's name until the name learned to walk. What everyone agrees on is the feeling of the day. The house breathes, the fields hold their breath. Melinda moves through rooms with the invisible skill of someone who has survived by paying attention. She is a cleaner by title and a witness by necessity. For 8 years she has swept what cruelty leaves behind, her face made of still water. Beside her life runs Nora's, her younger sister's, boiling and steaming in a laundry where blood rinses into a trough and disappears downstream as if water could absolve it. Each evening the sisters meet at the property's edge, where the ground is trampled and the moon can listen. In whispers, they stitch themselves back together. Their mother used to say a name spoken in love is a thread. Say it enough times, and it holds. On nights like this, they are all thread. Melinda knows the house the way a surgeon knows a body, which ribs are breakable, where the pulse runs quick, which nerves light up pain. In Anson's office, she has dusted the jars that hold teeth, hair, small trophies that pretend to be specimens. She has wiped the shine back onto the desk where contracts turned lives into columns of ink. She has seen the notebooks that pretend cruelty is knowledge, the genealogy trees that calculate temperament like a sum, the letters from Charleston and New Orleans that trade people the way others trade horses. She has seen Anson's gaze sharpen as it turns toward her, like a man flipping a page on which he has already underlined the sentence he wants. And in one of those meetings on the cold edge of night, Melinda tells Nora that a proposal is coming wrapped in polite words, armed with terrible meaning. Freedom is a coin being dangled where both sisters can see it. The price, everyone understands, is life paid in pieces. There are places in the South where such programs are not rumor but policy. Women treated as breeding stock, journals tracking cycles as if time belonged to the man who held the pen. Rich men justify it with talk of improvement, as if humanity were a horse that could be refined. The lie works best when said in rooms that smell of old wood and respectability. But this is also a world thick with counter-knowledge, what the law denies but the people keep. In hush harbors under trees where no patrol goes, prayer has learned to keep watch. Along the river, news moves faster than the barges, who ran, where the hounds were turned back by swamp. Which Quaker farm will not ask questions so long as the traveling is quiet and the shoes do not mark the floor. Anson believes surveillance breaks solidarity. He is right, until he isn't. Because every system has a seam, and every seam has a hand testing it for slack. The last week of the year, Melinda notices patterns that would not matter to anyone who hadn't taught herself to see. The candle in Anson's office burns longer. Bertrand drinks earlier. Philip counts money with the devotion of a monk who has mistaken coins for prayers. Myron laughs at nothing and then laughs again. Keys pass from hook to pocket to desk with a traveler's regularity. The dogs are fed too well to wonder about unusual scents. The cold cuts the air into glass. If there were an instrument for measuring purpose, the needle would tremble in the red. Legends always face the same accusation, that they grow in the telling, that they put muscle where there was only bone. But a legend also returns what official histories take away: fear, awe, dread, the throb of danger. And on the 31st of December 1859, what happened at the Mackenzie place felt like an answer to a question the world had been too cowardly to ask aloud. What becomes of people when the law worships power and calls it order? Some become silent, some forget. Others, like Melinda, become something the system has no language for. When she wakes before the house and the dark still belongs to the fields, she feels it not hope, exactly, but the steadying weight of a decision placed in her hands like iron. Outside, the river keeps its counsel. Inside, the main house waits for footsteps, for trays and orders, for the well-practiced ritual by which one group serves and another believes itself immortal. Melinda ties her apron and smooths its edge with a palm that has memorized the geography of every room. If anyone notices her eyes, they will misread them as emptiness. Emptiness is a shield if you learn to hold it right. Later, people will argue about where the first spark came from, whether grief lit it, or rage, or a love so stubborn it refused to die. The songs that carry her name disagree about details but never about essence. That on the last morning of the last day of the year, in a city that sold people like bushels, a woman who had been treated as less than human became the most human thing of all. She chose. And when the choosing was done, the house that called itself invulnerable would learn what every empire learns. The foundation it mistook for stone was only fear, and fear melts. The dawn rises slow, as if reluctant to see what the day intends. Frost softens, smoke climbs. Somewhere a church bell coughs a single note and then thinks better of it. In the kitchen, a kettle moans. In the corridor outside Anson's office, the floorboard that never creaks remembers to keep quiet. The old year is dying. The new one is sharpening a blade you cannot see. This is how the legend begins, not with an explosion, but with a breath held and not released, with a hand closing around a key, with a woman who has run out of room for fear and found, in the space fear used to occupy, a purpose that does not shake. Stop. The Mackenzie plantation had always seemed prosperous, but beneath its polished veneer it was something far darker. To the outside world, Anson Mackenzie had inherited a modest estate and expanded it into a thriving cotton operation. To those forced to live under his rule, it was no plantation at all, it was a school, though not one of reading or arithmetic. This was a place where cruelty was studied, refined, and perfected with the precision of science. Enslavers throughout Virginia whispered about it in careful tones. When a rebellious man or woman could not be subdued on another estate, they were sent here. Owners called it correction. In truth, it was punishment masked as education, a laboratory of suffering disguised as discipline. Anson himself took pride in this reputation, though never publicly. Among trusted circles, the Mackenzie place was known as the school, a place that manufactured obedience as if it were another crop. From the fields, a casual visitor might never suspect. Cotton rows spread wide, the air filled with the dull thud of hoes and the rhythm of labor. Overseers watched from horseback, and the facade looked no different than any other plantation along the James. But behind this mask stood a system of carefully divided spaces, each designed for a specific lesson in breaking the human spirit. There were the isolation cabins, narrow and windowless, where men and women were left alone with their thoughts for weeks at a time. Inside, they could not track the hours or the days food arrived at random intervals, delivered silently, denying them even the small comfort of routine. Time itself dissolved, and when the door finally opened, some emerged too dazed to speak, their will scoured away by silence. Others never returned to themselves at all. The converted stables were worse. Here, young women were pressed into forced reproduction, their bodies treated as breeding stock. The air stank of sweat, blood, and fear. But to Anson, it was data. He tracked cycles, births, and deaths, with the same neat handwriting he used to calculate cotton yields. He believed he was breeding a stronger, more submissive generation. It was livestock logic, applied to human lives. The basement of the main house was the true heart of the school. It was here that Anson kept his notebooks, dozens of leather-bound volumes where he recorded each experiment with an obsessive hand. He had theories about the human mind, theories that married cold observation with savage invention. He wanted to know how long a person could remain awake before their mind began to fracture, so he forced some to stand, eyes propped open with crude devices, while others beat drums through the night. He believed fear could be sharpened into a tool, so he engineered noises, chains dragged across stone, sudden crashes in the dark that kept people trembling without rest. Among his inventions was what he chillingly called correction by silence. In this method, victims were kept in total darkness, in a room where no sound could reach them, except their own breathing. Meals were meager, watery porridge delivered without warning, so that hunger and hopelessness blurred together. Days became hallucinations. Some came out pliant, too dazed to resist. Others never found their minds again. Anson's cruelty was not random, it was deliberate. He encouraged children to inform on their parents, offering scraps of food as rewards. He pitted slave against slave, building a lattice of suspicion so thick that trust itself became dangerous. Solidarity, that most powerful shield of the oppressed, was broken into shards. This was his true genius, not just pain, but division. Such practices were not unique to the Mackenzie estate, though here they were refined to an art. Across the South, enslavers had developed systems to break resistance. The seasoning camps of the Caribbean had long been known, where newly captured Africans were brutalized into submission before being shipped to North America. Some scholars later compared Anson's school to those earlier methods, but with a veneer of false science. He claimed his work was clinical, almost medical, an exploration of human behavior. In reality, it was terror dressed up in the language of progress. The instruments in his basement bore witness, iron devices that tightened slowly, pressing on nerves until pain flared without leaving bruises, chairs that bent the body into angles that became agony after hours, chains fixed at just the wrong height, so a man had to balance on his toes or dislocate his shoulders, all of it catalogued, as if human suffering could be charted on a graph. This was the environment into which Melinda and her sister Nora had been thrown. They were children when they arrived, orphans sold after their parents perished in a fire. For 8 years, Melinda scrubbed the very floors where Anson's experiments left their stains, memorizing every detail while wearing an expression blank enough to keep her safe. Nora bent over steaming tubs in the laundry, her hands raw and scarred from boiling lye. Each day they endured. Each night they whispered to one another, clinging to the fragile spark of humanity that Anson sought to extinguish. The Mackenzie property was more than land, it was a design, a blueprint of terror. Every building was a tool, every schedule a test, every rule a blade honed against the spirit. And at its center stood Anson, a man who convinced himself he was not a monster but a scholar, an innovator. He saw the breaking of human beings as proof of his own mastery. He failed to see that by documenting his every cruelty, he was also writing the script of his own destruction. In the winter of 1858, the school would offer Melinda a lesson unlike any other. It would be presented as a proposal, cloaked in promises of freedom, but it was in truth the most dangerous cruelty yet. For Anson had turned his gaze directly upon her. And when the Mackenzie master fixed his eyes on a person, that gaze was a prison of its own. Anson Mackenzie's empire of pain was not his alone. Cruelty ran in the bloodline, inherited and honed like a family trade. His 3 eldest sons had grown up in the house of silence and screams, taught not in schoolrooms but in basements, absorbing methods of domination the way others might learn farming or carpentry. Each boy grew into manhood carrying his own signature of cruelty, as though Anson had crafted them into extensions of his will. The firstborn, Bertrand, was 30 years old and built like an ox. Where Anson experimented with the mind, Bertrand relied on the body. He believed obedience could be forged through sheer physical torment. It was he who designed the reflection room, a chamber where men and women were hung by their wrists from chains, left to balance precariously on their toes. Hours would stretch until shoulders screamed, joints threatened to tear, and unconsciousness crept close. Bertrand stood watch, not with impatience but with a predator's fascination, noting how long each person resisted before the body gave out. His obsession was suffering without scars. He prided himself on methods that could render a rebellious slave docile while leaving no outward sign of abuse. That way, the corrected could be sold at premium price, their obedience mistaken for natural submission rather than carefully engineered trauma. Bertrand learned to apply pressure to nerves so specific that pain would flood through a body without leaving marks. Yet his most devastating cruelty was psychological. He often forced parents to watch their children endure these torments, ensuring that even when the body healed, the mind never did. Fear was multiplied when it was shared. Philip, the second son at 27, was quieter, almost scholarly in his viciousness. Where Bertrand relied on brute force, Philip refined manipulation. He had studied writings on mental alienation and twisted those ideas into a handbook of subjugation. His methods were subtle, divide, confuse, and corrupt. He created competitions among the enslaved, small privileges dangled like bait. A spoonful of extra food, a less filthy blanket, a moment of rest. People who might have been allies became rivals, clawing for scraps while forgetting that their true enemy sat watching. Philip's genius lay in forcing impossible choices. A mother might be told to pick which child would eat that night. A father might be forced to choose which of his sons would take a whipping. Every decision planted seeds of guilt that rotted a family from within. To Philip, this was progress breaking not the back, but the very bonds that gave people strength. Those who survived his games often carried the weight of betrayal heavier than any chain. The youngest, Myron, only 22, embodied chaos itself. He was unpredictable, cruel for the sake of entertainment. Where his brothers calculated, Myron improvised. He collected trophies from his victims, teeth pried loose, locks of hair, trinkets stolen from pockets, each catalogued in a box under his bed like grisly souvenirs. He invented games of humiliation, public spectacles, where people were forced to degrade themselves before others. In one contest, starving men fought over scraps of food while the rest were forced to cheer and jeer as though at a carnival. In another, families were made to auction one another, pretending to sell their own blood. Laughter echoed in the rafters while dignity was stripped away. The Mackenzie sons were not outliers in the world of slavery. They were its natural outcome. The system raised children to see domination as a birthright and violence as a language. Across the South, the sons of planters inherited not just land and wealth but the expectation of control, often exercised with a casual brutality that seemed normal to them. Bertrand, Philip, and Myron were extreme, but they were not alien. They were the logical heirs of a system that rewarded cruelty. At the Mackenzie table, they sat beside their father like apprentices beside a master. Dinner conversations became seminars in domination. Bertrand spoke of endurance, Philip of strategy, Myron of spectacle. They competed in cruelty, each boasting of who had bent a spirit further, who had invented a more lasting torment. Their father listened, corrected, encouraged. In their minds, they were not monsters but craftsmen, each perfecting his own discipline, but the very precision of their cruelty became a weakness. By recording, categorizing, and competing, they left patterns that could be studied. Melinda, moving silently through their rooms, learned these rhythms. She wiped blood Bertrand left on the floor. She dusted Philip's ledgers. She emptied the basin where Myron washed his trophies. Every task added to her knowledge. She understood their strengths and their blind spots, the way a hunter learns the habits of prey. The legend says that while the brothers sharpened their cruelty, Melinda sharpened her memory. In the blankness of her expression, in the silence of her step, she was cataloging everything, every tool, every technique, every careless boast. What the Mackenzies failed to see was that a house designed to study others could itself be studied. Their lessons in control were writing a manual for their own undoing. For now, the brothers strutted through their domains, each certain of his power. Bertrand flexing his muscles of flesh, Philip weaving invisible webs of guilt, Myron grinning at his grotesque games. Together, they formed a trinity of cruelty that stood like pillars around their father's throne. Yet even pillars, no matter how strong, can crack when the foundation shifts beneath them. And unknown to them, that foundation was already trembling in the quiet footsteps of the girl who cleaned their bloodstains and kept her face as still as stone. Among the many shadows cast on the Mackenzie estate, two flickered with quiet defiance: Melinda and her younger sister, Nora. They had been bought as children, bundled together after their parents died in a fire on a neighboring plantation. For most, such an early loss meant the complete shattering of family ties, but for these sisters, it had the opposite effect. Their grief fused into something unbreakable. What remained of their childhood was burned away in those flames, leaving only the bond between them as anchor and compass in a world designed to strip away both. By the time she reached adulthood, Melinda had become part of the main house machinery. For 8 years, she worked as a cleaner, her life spent wiping away the traces of violence that others tried to forget. She mopped blood that seeped into wooden floors after sessions, gathered broken teeth scattered like ivory beads, laundered rags that told silent stories of torture. Each day she perfected a mask, a hollow, detached expression that convinced the Mackenzies she was numb, obedient, harmless. In reality, every detail imprinted itself into her memory with the precision of a ledger. Which tools left, which stains, how long screams lasted before turning to silence, which brother left which signature on a victim's body. Her sister Nora, 17, had a different post, the laundry. Here the air was a choking cloud of heat and steam, the sting of lye burning her hands until they cracked and bled. She spent 16-hour days scrubbing blood from linens, smoke from uniforms, fluids from garments that no human being should have to touch. She learned tricks no girl should ever know: how fresh blood differs from dried, which stains require ash, which demand boiling water. Her lungs rattled with a persistent cough from years of caustic vapors, but she never complained. Like Melinda, she carried her suffering in silence, her spirit bent but never broken. At night, the sisters found each other. After long days of silence and cruelty, they met behind the laundry or at the edge of the fields, where the cover of darkness and the hum of cicadas hid their whispers. These moments were stolen fragments of freedom, scraps of humanity salvaged from a system intent on their erasure. They spoke of their mother, who had collapsed in the fields years ago, her body claimed by exhaustion, but her memory kept alive in these stolen conversations. They spoke of dreams, distant places where chains did not clink at every movement, where eyes could meet without fear. Their nightly meetings were not merely acts of comfort, they were acts of resistance. In a world where Anson encouraged betrayal and suspicion, where even children were rewarded for informing on their parents, the sisters' loyalty to one another was itself an act of rebellion. Each whisper was a reminder that solidarity had not been completely extinguished. Each secret glance carried more meaning than any chain could contain. Melinda's role inside the main house made her an involuntary archivist of horror. She had seen Anson's notebooks, written in neat columns that disguised brutality as scientific curiosity. She knew of his genealogical charts, where he recorded parentage and temperament, as though breeding human beings was no different from breeding horses. She had even overheard his correspondence with traders in New Orleans, letters that spoke in cold, coded terms about specimens, lineages, and premium qualities. One December evening in 1858, Melinda returned to their nightly meeting with her voice low but urgent. She had overheard something troubling. Anson had spoken of an agreement with a trader from Charleston, a special delivery involving what he called premium merchandise. During the conversation, he had looked at her with an expression that sent a chill colder than the winter air. For the first time, Melinda feared not just for her daily survival, but for her very future. She told Nora in whispers, the words nearly stolen by the hiss of laundry water and the crackle of frost in the night air. They clutched each other's hands, the steam-scorched and the calloused, the younger trembling at the thought of what special might mean. Neither could have known then that this conversation marked the beginning of a chain of events that would lead them into the darkest depths of Anson's cruelty and eventually into the fire of vengeance. The Mackenzie estate presented itself as a place of order. Imported rugs softened its floors, European crystal glittered on its tables, chains gleamed as decorations on its walls. But the real heart of the place was exposed in the smallest details. The iron key always at Anson's belt, the notebooks stacked like scripture, the way the brothers laughed over torment as though it were sport. In this theater of cruelty, Melinda and Nora clung to one another like the last two flames in a house of ash. It was this bond, the whispered conversations, the nightly rituals of remembrance that kept them tethered to their humanity, but it also painted a target on their backs. For Anson, attachment was weakness to be exploited. And in his calculating mind, the sisters' loyalty was not merely an inconvenience, it was an opportunity. By the winter of 1858, his gaze had settled fully on Melinda. Soon, he would call her into his office with a proposal cloaked in civility, but rooted in barbarism. It was a proposition that would test the sisters' bond, shatter their remaining illusions, and set into motion the legend that would eventually carry Melinda's name into eternity. December of 1858 brought with it a winter so sharp it cut into the bones, and with it came the summons that would change Melinda's life forever. She was ordered into Anson Mackenzie's office, a room she knew well from her years of cleaning, but had never entered under such conditions. To others it was a sanctuary of wealth, mahogany shelves, Persian carpets, maps inked with trade routes. To Melinda, it was a mausoleum of suffering disguised as sophistication. Here, ledgers recorded men and women as units of labor. Glass jars on the shelves held grisly specimens, teeth, hair, bits of bone. And on the great desk where contracts were signed with a flourish, Anson now prepared to offer what he called an opportunity. He spoke with the calm cadence of a man discussing business. His words were polished, wrapped in promises that sounded like mercy. If Melinda agreed to bear a child for his program, he would sell both her and Nora to a northern family, perhaps Quakers known for their relative kindness. He painted the deal as a rare chance at freedom, but beneath the surface, it was a proposition rooted in dehumanization. Melinda would be forced into what Anson clinically described as a breeding project, a program that treated human beings as livestock, their wombs turned into investments, their children commodities. Anson had been planning such a project for years. His notebooks detailed the cycles of women's bodies, their diets, their behaviors. He had studied the principles of horse breeding, drawing diagrams that reduced women to charts of fertility. He had already constructed cabins at the back of the property, small, windowless structures built not for shelter but for control. Each was designed with psychological precision. Windows placed too high to glimpse the outside world. Temperatures kept just uncomfortable enough to agitate. Disturbing sounds played softly through the night. There were peepholes hidden in the walls so that women never knew when they were being watched. Constant surveillance, Anson believed, bred paranoia, and paranoia bred obedience. That evening, Melinda whispered the proposal to Nora, while the hiss of boiling laundry masked their voices. The decision was impossible. To accept meant subjecting herself to horrors beyond imagination, in the hope, likely false, that they might one day be freed. To refuse meant a lifetime of the same servitude, or worse. Together, they turned the problem over in hushed tones, weighing nightmares against each other. For Melinda, the choice was not hope, but a gamble. To grasp at the chance of freedom, even through hell, seemed better than surrendering to despair. What neither sister realized was that Anson's promise was a trap from the beginning. His program was not about producing valuable children to sell, but about studying how thoroughly he could break a woman's spirit by weaponizing her very capacity for motherhood. Freedom was never the goal. The true experiment was destruction disguised as opportunity. In January 1859, the plan began. The man introduced as Josiah from Henrico County, supposedly chosen for his superior qualities, was in reality another broken soul, Samuel, a thin, hollow-eyed survivor purchased from a failing plantation. His scars were fresh, his voice barely above a whisper. Anson had chosen him not for strength, but for weakness. He believed that trauma itself could be passed down through blood, that fear and submission could be bred like temperament in a racehorse. Samuel's body was evidence of violence, his spirit, evidence of surrender. He was perfect for Anson's twisted theories. The ceremony was clinical, stripped of humanity. Melinda was placed in one of the new cabins, rough wood floors that bruised bare feet, walls painted gray to stifle the senses, a foul odor rising from an old septic tank beneath. The air was thick, the light dim and irregular. It was architecture designed not for life but for disorientation. Outside, Bertrand watched as enforcer, ensuring that compliance was never in question. Every detail was orchestrated, every cruelty deliberate. In the months that followed, Melinda was subjected to the full weight of the breeding program. Her meals were controlled with precision, nutritious enough to promote fertility, but served at unpredictable times to keep her unsettled. At night, she was awakened for examinations that were not medical but humiliating rituals designed to strip her dignity. Cold instruments, unnecessary probing, sessions that blurred into torment. Philip conducted maternal counseling, pretending to prepare her for motherhood, while in reality drilling into her mind the notion that her worth lay solely in her capacity to produce children for sale. His method was psychological colonization, reshaping her identity until she began to see herself as they defined her. Myron, meanwhile, appeared whenever Anson sensed Melinda adapting. His visits were deliberately timed to crush any fragile hope she built. He described in grotesque detail what would happen to her child after birth, how it would be torn from her arms, raised to be even more submissive than she had been, sold into darkness. He laughed as he painted these futures, ensuring that even the idea of motherhood was laced with terror. Yet through all of this, Melinda endured. She watched, catalogued, survived. Where others might have broken, she wore her emptiness like armor. Outwardly compliant, inwardly calculating, she became a mirror of the house itself, absorbing horror in silence, storing it, waiting. By the 6th month, Anson escalated the torment. He increased her workload, forced her into heavy labor despite her visible exhaustion. It was deliberate. He wanted to see how much strain a pregnant body could endure before it failed. The result was inevitable. One afternoon in the barn, pain ripped through Melinda's body, and blood pooled at her feet. The child was born too small, too fragile, and did not survive. Nora found her sister unconscious hours later, her body pale and broken. When Melinda awoke days later, the first thing she saw was Anson, watching with detached interest, scribbling notes in his ledger. He spoke of failure, of trying again, of lessons learned from the experiment. For him, Melinda's agony was simply data, but in that moment, something inside her shifted. The last ember of hope, fragile, flickering, died with the child, and in its place, something colder took root. Not despair, not resignation, but a clarity that froze her heart into steel. Anson believed he had broken her. What he did not realize was that by stripping away her hope, he had created a woman who had nothing left to lose. And that is the most dangerous kind of person. The loss of her child should have left Melinda hollow. That was the point of Anson's experiment, to grind her into despair so total that resistance would never again stir in her veins. But instead, the miscarriage birthed something else. In the silence that followed the child's death, while her body lay recovering under Nora's watchful care, a terrible clarity crystallized inside her. She no longer believed in freedom as a promise from others. Freedom, she realized, could only be taken, forged in fire and sharpened like iron. On the surface, she returned to her duties with a mechanical calm that impressed even her tormentors. She moved through the main house like a ghost, scrubbing, sweeping, bowing her head when addressed. To the Mackenzies, she seemed broken, obedient, her will extinguished, but behind her stillness, every detail was being recorded with a mind sharpened by grief. Which floorboards creaked, where Bertrand hung his whip, how often Philip disappeared into his counting rituals, the places Myron kept his trophies, even Anson's reliance on a bottle of bitter medicine, sipped when his heart faltered. She absorbed it all, not as a servant but as a strategist. Meanwhile, Anson's appetite for innovation grew darker. The Mackenzie basement became a labyrinth of experiments that reached beyond cruelty into grotesque parody of science. Some cells were lit with blinding lamps that never dimmed, others plunged into unbroken darkness. A few were kept sweltering, the heat unbearable, while others were freezing cold. The goal was not death, but disintegration, the unmaking of a human spirit. Anson wanted to know how long the mind could endure before it shattered into submission. Philip expanded his methods with the precision of a scholar gone mad. He cultivated a small pharmacological garden, filling it with plants that produced psychoactive effects. From these, he crafted tinctures and powders, some that sparked euphoria followed by crushing despair, others that created dependency or nausea so persistent that resistance became impossible. Through contacts at universities, he even obtained experimental drugs, testing them not on rats or dogs but on men and women whose only crime was refusing to bow. He kept meticulous notes, treating each broken mind as proof of his genius. Bertrand's experiments focused on the body. He had studied anatomy, identifying nerve clusters where pressure caused excruciating pain without leaving mark. He timed his punishments with clinical precision, charting how long it took for a victim to faint, how long until they begged, how long until silence swallowed them. His goal was efficiency, slaves who could be tortured into obedience and still sold for profit, their scars invisible beneath the skin. Myron, unpredictable as ever, developed his own rituals. He staged mock auctions, forcing families to bid on their own members, laughing while despair hollowed their faces. He made people perform degrading spectacles, then documented the results as though humiliation itself were a metric worth measuring. He scored each act of suffering, reducing lives to numbers in his grotesque ledger. Through it all, Melinda remained silent. She cleaned blood, emptied basins, carried scraps of overheard knowledge back to Nora in whispers. Each horror she endured only steeled her further. By outwardly accepting her role, she learned the contours of her captor's cruelty more intimately than anyone else could. Every cruelty was a lesson, every torment a preparation. The miscarriage had not been an accident of overwork, as Anson pretended. It had been the design all along. He wanted to see how trauma could fracture even the strongest spirit, to confirm his belief that despair was the surest leash. But instead, he achieved the opposite. When Melinda rose from her sickbed, she no longer searched for mercy. She understood now that there would be none. She no longer prayed for freedom to be given. She knew it had to be taken. It was during this time that she first began noticing Tobias the blacksmith, whose forge stood at the edge of the property. Tobias was a man apart, broad-shouldered and quiet, with eyes that carried the weight of old battles. His hammer blows rang out steady and sure, shaping iron in the fire with the patience of someone who had learned to master both metal and himself. Melinda began to see in him something familiar. The same mask she wore, the same quiet fury banked behind silence. He had survived years of Mackenzie cruelty without being broken, not because he had surrendered, but because he was waiting. Anson believed Melinda's spirit had been shattered, but in truth, she had become something new, something colder, sharper, forged in the same fire Tobias used to shape steel. Together, their paths were about to converge, and when they did, the Mackenzies' empire of cruelty would learn the most dangerous truth of all, that those with nothing left to lose are those who cannot be controlled. The forge stood at the edge of the Mackenzie estate, its smoke rising in quiet defiance against the Virginia sky. To most, It was a place of utility where chains were repaired, tools sharpened, hinges fixed. To Tobias, the man who labored there, it was a sanctuary. Fire roared in the hearth, iron bent under his hands, and with each strike of the hammer, he transformed raw ore into order. In that firelight, he carved out something the Mackenzies could never extinguish: patience. Tobias had been sold to the Mackenzies years before, a young rebel whose strength had made him dangerous. Other owners had failed to control him, but Anson's methods were different. Instead of whipping him into collapse, they had given him the forge. It was work that required strength, precision, and access to nearly every building on the property. In that apparent concession lay Tobias's survival. He used his skills not only to serve but to observe, memorizing the estate as if it were a map, where doors locked and unlocked, where shadows lingered, when guards grew careless, which brothers kept to which patterns. Beneath his outward obedience smoldered an ember of defiance. The Mackenzies had stolen his daughter, Grace, an 8-year-old girl who showed a spark too bright for their liking. She had asked questions, resisted small cruelties, and for that she was sold south to Louisiana. Tobias had never forgiven, but he learned to wait. His forge became both a workplace and a metaphor. Iron only becomes a weapon after enduring fire and strike. He understood that rebellion was not a sudden flame but a slow burn, biding its time until the metal was ready. When Melinda began appearing near the forge, bringing linens to mend or tools to return, Tobias noticed her silence first. Not the silence of defeat, but of someone who was listening, storing, planning. He recognized it because he wore the same mask. Their early conversations were careful, about the weather, about work. But beneath those words grew a recognition. They were kindred spirits, bound by grief and sharpened by loss. Slowly, trust unfolded. Tobias began sharing fragments of his knowledge. He showed Melinda how different metals bent under heat, how alloys were stronger when forged together than alone. The lesson was practical, but it carried another meaning. Two people bound in alliance could become something greater than either alone. He spoke, too, of the family's weaknesses: Anson's failing heart and his reliance on medicine, Bertrand's sleepwalking when drunk, Philip's obsession with money so total he lost awareness of the world around him, Myron's irrational fear of darkness, an irony cruelly at odds with his own methods. Each detail was an opening in the Mackenzies' armor. Together, Melinda and Tobias developed a language invisible to overseers. A glance held for 3 seconds meant now. A touch on the shoulder meant ready. 3 taps on a table meant change of plans. These were gestures that looked like nothing, but carried entire sentences of meaning. In a world where even whispers could be punished, this code gave them a lifeline. At night, when the plantation quieted, Tobias worked on something in secret. Officially, he was repairing farm tools. In reality, he was crafting a weapon. He melted down old horseshoes, reforged them with oak handles, and shaped them into a blade neither sword nor axe, but a hybrid of both. Heavy enough to strike with finality, balanced enough to be wielded by two. He worked only in the deepest hours, when the wind could mask the dull ring of his hammer. He wrapped his tools in cloth to soften their blows, and fed his fire so carefully that its crackle never betrayed him. The weapon was more than iron. It was a symbol, forged from scraps the Mackenzies had overlooked, born in the same flames they had thought to control. Tobias designed it for 2 hands, 2 people. Alone, it was unwieldy. Together, it was unstoppable. Just like him and Melinda. As 1,859 waned, the sisters' unease grew sharper. The promise of freedom Anson had dangled seemed increasingly hollow. Melinda and Nora had done their part. She had carried the pregnancy, suffered the loss, endured the torment, yet no word came of their supposed release. Tobias, seasoned in the Mackenzies' lies, knew the truth. Anson had never intended to honor his promise. Hope was just another tool of control, raised to keep the enslaved from collapsing under despair, then snatched away to remind them who held power. But this time, Anson had miscalculated. In Melinda, his cruelty had not bred obedience, but something colder, and in Tobias, years of grief had tempered patience into purpose. Together, they formed an alliance stronger than chains. By December's end, their plan was ready. Supplies were hidden: food, clothes, even the blade itself. wrapped in waxed canvas against the damp. Escape routes were memorized, paths through swamps where dogs would falter, safe houses whispered of in work songs and stitched into quilts. Melinda knew the household patterns to the minute. Tobias knew the property's bones as intimately as a blacksmith knows his forge. The Mackenzies believed they had broken both. What they had really done was forge them like iron shaped in fire, hardened by loss, sharpened by rage. And as the year gasped its last breaths, the steel they had created together was about to be tested. The morning of the 31st of December 1859 began not with festivity but with judgment. Frost glazed the grass, breath smoked in the cold, and Melinda and Nora were summoned to the courtyard. 4 Mackenzie men waited there, Anson at the center, his 3 sons forming a semicircle behind him. The arrangement looked less like a family gathering and more like a tribunal. Anson's words fell like hammer blows. The promise of freedom, already fragile, was now officially revoked. Melinda, he declared, had failed in her obligation. By losing the child, she had broken her part of the bargain. Only Nora, he claimed, would be sold north. Melinda would remain. His tone was calm, almost administrative, as if condemning a woman's life to perpetual torment was no more serious than settling an account ledger. When Nora protested, reminding him that the agreement had been for both sisters, the brothers laughed. Bertrand, with cruel amusement, declared that an agreement was only what his father said it was. Philip added, with quiet venom, that Melinda knew too much of the family's operations to be released. Myron grinned, eyes gleaming with the anticipation of suffering. The sisters' bond, their whispered resilience, their shared hope was about to be turned into a weapon against them. Bertrand drew out a whip, unlike the ordinary tools of discipline. This one was his masterpiece. 9 braided leather strips, each tipped with sharpened pieces of metal. It had been crafted not to correct, but to destroy. He announced that Nora had attempted to escape, a lie transparent to everyone present, but one that gave him the pretense he desired. She would be punished publicly, as an example. The first strike cracked through the cold air like thunder. Nora staggered but did not fall. The second tore open her skin. By the 5th, blood darkened the frozen ground. Bertrand lashed with methodical precision, each blow designed to prolong pain without granting death. Philip restrained Melinda, forcing her to watch. Myron counted the lashes aloud as though calling the rounds of a sport. Anson observed with his ever-present notebook, recording her reactions as though her agony were a scientific trial. At 10 lashes, Nora clenched her jaw, determined not to scream. At 15, her knees buckled, but she forced herself upright, blood running down her arms. At 20, she collapsed, hands trembling as she tried to shield her face. Bertrand continued, unrelenting. 30, 40. By then, she was a ruin of blood and torn flesh, still barely breathing. Melinda broke free too late. She cradled her sister's broken body in her arms, the frost beneath them stained scarlet. Nora's eyes fluttered open long enough to whisper her final words, ragged but resolute, "Don't let them win." Then her body went limp, the last breath escaping into the icy morning. Anson stepped forward, calm as ever, remarking that now Melinda had no one left. He believed this loss would crush her entirely, leaving her pliant and alone. But when Melinda lifted her gaze to him, there was something in her eyes that made even Anson hesitate. It was not despair, it was not defeat, it was a lethal coldness, sharper than any blade. That day, the house did not prepare for the usual New Year's festivities. Anson cancelled the gathering, citing weather and business, but the true reason was darker. He considered the matter settled, the lesson delivered. To him, Nora's death was data and discipline, nothing more. But in reality, Nora's murder did not extinguish the flame, it ignited it. The bond between sisters, so long the Mackenzies' tool of manipulation, had become Melinda's final catalyst. In trying to erase her last tether to hope, Anson had instead forged something the family had never intended, a woman with nothing left to lose, carrying a promise sealed in her sister's blood. That night, as the house settled into its routines, Bertrand inspecting stables, Philip secluding himself with his coins, Myron drinking himself into oblivion, and Anson absorbed in his ledgers, Melinda moved through the halls as she always had, silent, precise, unseen. To the Mackenzies, she was invisible, the servant who blended into the machinery of their comfort. But in her mind, Every detail of that day had been written in fire, and every detail was about to be repaid in blood. Nora had said, "Don't let them win." Melinda would not. She could not. For now, vengeance was no longer a thought whispered in darkness. It had become her purpose, and it would begin before the year died. Night fell heavy over the Mackenzie estate on the 31st of December 1859. The cold cut through the walls, but inside the house the routine unfolded with clockwork precision, as it always did. That predictability was its strength and, on this night, its fatal weakness. Anson retreated to his office, immersed in his ledgers, scribbling as though paperwork could preserve his dynasty. Bertrand made his rounds at the stables, inspecting horses as if their health mattered more than the souls he had broken. Philip withdrew to his study, counting coins with the obsession of a miser who mistook gold for God. And Myron, drunk and restless, lurked in the parlor, muttering to himself, replaying Nora's death in slurred detail. In the shadows, Melinda and Tobias moved as one. Their eyes met by Nora's shallow grave. 3 seconds, the signal. Tobias retrieved the weapon from its hiding place, the heavy blade wrapped in canvas, forged in silence. Now it would speak. The plan began with Myron. He stumbled out into the night, heading toward his favorite tree where he often relieved himself, muttering as he went. Tobias waited in the dark, the weapon ready. Myron never saw the blow that cleaved his skull, silencing his laughter forever. The body hit the frozen earth with a dull finality. One brother down. Next came Philip. He sat hunched over his desk, coins stacked like little monuments to greed. Melinda entered carrying a tray, her movements rehearsed and silent. He barely glanced up, nodding automatically. Tobias emerged from the shadows, the blade flashing in candlelight. One swift strike, and Philip's head dropped, blood soaking the coins he cherished more than human life. 2 brothers gone. Bertrand returned from the stables, the smell of hay and sweat clinging to him. He caught sight of Tobias first, the gleam of blood still wet on the blade, and lunged for the pistol at his hip. But Melinda was already behind him, gripping his arms with the strength born of years of toil and the fury of fresh grief. Her hold stunned him long enough for Tobias to drive the blade into his chest. Bertrand staggered, eyes wide, as though unable to believe pain could reach him too. Fear, not arrogance, filled them at last. He collapsed in a pool of his own blood. 3 brothers silenced. Only Anson remained. He sat at his desk, candlelight flickering across pages of contracts, when the door opened. Expecting one of his sons, he looked up and froze. Melinda stood before him, her face unreadable. Tobias followed, the blade dripping the blood of his dynasty. Anson did not beg. He smiled faintly, as if recognizing the inevitability of the moment, as though this too were a lesson in his grotesque school. He leaned back, studying them like specimens. "I underestimated you," he said calmly, pen still in hand. Even in the face of death, he could not stop analyzing. Tobias placed the weapon in Melinda's hands. Its weight was heavy, yet it fit as if made for her. She raised it with steady arms. "This is for Nora," she whispered, her voice low but lethal, "and for Grace, and for all the others whose names we never knew." The blade fell. With that strike, decades of cruelty ended in silence. They worked quickly. Documents of sales and punishments burned in the fireplace, the flames consuming records that had chained hundreds of lives. Keys were distributed among the enslaved. The money Philip had hoarded was left behind not as restitution, which was impossible, but as survival for those who chose to flee. The response among the enslaved was varied. Some, trembling with years of conditioning, remained frozen, unable to imagine a life beyond the estate. Others seized the chance, scattering into the night like sparks leaping from a fire. For the first time, the Mackenzie estate was not a prison, but a broken cage. When the church bell tolled midnight, the year 1860 arrived to find the dynasty in ruins. The buildings still stood, but everything the Mackenzies had built, fear, obedience, their reputation of invincibility had been gutted. By dawn, the plantation was ashes in spirit, even if flames had never touched its walls. Before leaving, Melinda knelt by Nora's grave, her fingers pressed into the cold earth, her voice a whisper carried by frost. "It's done. They paid. Rest now." Tobias waited, 2 bundles slung over his shoulder, food, warm clothes, and the bloodied blade, no longer a tool but a relic of justice. Together, they walked into the frozen dark. They did not run. did not stumble. They moved with the deliberate certainty of those who had executed a plan and were now carrying it into its final phase. Behind them lay silence, broken chains, and a legend already beginning to take shape. By dawn of the new year, the Mackenzie estate was no longer a dynasty. It was a carcass. The masters were dead, their ledgers burned, their empire of fear shattered. The enslaved who remained stood in the silent courtyards as though awakening from a fever dream, struggling to understand what freedom even meant. Some fled that very night, vanishing into forests and swamps, following whispered routes toward safety. Others lingered, paralyzed by years of conditioning, uncertain whether the world beyond the gates was more dangerous than the one they knew. Authorities came in the days that followed, but they found little. The family's records were gone, the overseers scattered, the evidence consumed by fire. The Mackenzie reputation, once a name that planters invoked with respect and fear, crumbled like ash between fingers. Even the land itself turned against them. Without its human machinery, the plantation collapsed into ruin within months, eventually sold off in fragments to owners who never truly knew the horrors buried in its soil. The youngest son, Isaac Mackenzie, returned from his studies at a military academy to find his inheritance in ruins. He did what his father and brothers never could. He freed the remaining enslaved and began recording the stories of what had been done. His writings would circulate quietly, fragments of truth struggling to pierce through a society eager to forget. But his account alone could never explain the legend that began to grow. Melinda and Tobias disappeared into that cold January night, their fates uncertain. Some said they found refuge in the north, living quietly under false names. Others swore they joined maroon communities hidden in swamps, helping fugitives along secret routes of escape. Still others whispered that they returned years later, when the Civil War swept the South, to fight openly against the system that had tried to crush them. The truth was less important than the story, and the story became something larger than life. It spread first in songs sung under breath in the fields. The verses seemed harmless to white ears, but to those who listened with understanding, they carried instructions, warnings, hope. Quilts stitched with coded patterns mapped not only the Underground Railroad, but also the memory of Melinda's defiance. Mothers told daughters, daughters told granddaughters, each whisper a stitch holding the fabric of resistance together. Her name became a reminder that when law and systems serve only oppression, justice must sometimes be forged in other ways. Her story was not just revenge, it was strategy, patience, a cold determination honed by grief. It was proof that even under the heaviest chains, the human spirit can refuse to break. History books did not record Melinda. They rarely record women, especially women who were enslaved. But her legend outlived ink. On winter nights, some said the wind through the James River fields still carried her name, a whisper promising that empires built on suffering cannot last. That fear is never a permanent foundation, that those broken to nothing can rise with a strength that terrifies even their masters. And what does her legend teach us today? Not that violence is always the answer, but that silence in the face of cruelty is complicity, that when every avenue of mercy and justice is closed, resistance becomes survival, that freedom is not given, it is taken, often at a cost too heavy to imagine. Melinda's story does not end neatly. There is no record of her smiling in old age, no certainty of where she died or if she saw another spring. What endures is more powerful, the knowledge that on one frozen night in Virginia, a woman who had been treated as less than human rose to destroy those who believed themselves untouchable, that she carried her sister's last words, "Don't let them win," and turned them into action. It is not a fairy tale, it is a warning, a testament, a spark carried forward. And if the legend still unsettles us, still moves something deep within us, it is because it was never meant as entertainment. It was meant as memory, meant as a blade, meant as a reminder that justice delayed does not mean justice denied forever. And so, the tale of Melinda endures not in books or monuments, but in whispers, songs, and the stubborn belief that even the most broken can rise to break their chains.